It's a competitive world, and few places in the world are more competitive than countries like India or Bangladesh. In these massive emerging Asian giants, there is competition everywhere. For places in school, for jobs, for houses to live in, for a partner to marry, for a spot on the cricket team or a seat on the train. More fundamentally, there is competition for clean water and for food. And at one level, competition is very healthy. But when that contest is too great or too fierce, it creates vulnerability and desperation. And these are troubling elements when it comes to building a system of free and fair and equitable global trade. Hyper-competition creates irresistible pressure, pressure that is pushed downwards and only ever downwards, from consumers to retailers to factory owners to floor managers, all the way down until it reaches some of the poorest and most vulnerable workers in the world. For the problems of global supply chains, I would posit that fault lies at every level but one of the entire system. Now, this might seem unfair, but I would argue a measure of responsibility lies with the consumer, be they in Australia, the US, or in Europe. The bargain basement, two-for-one culture of competition that exists in first world markets contributes to that competition and contributes to driving wages down and working conditions down. What we buy here makes a difference on the other side of the world. And with a planet so interconnected now, it is not reasonable to argue ignorance. It is impossible now not to be aware that as consumers we are part of that broader global supply chain and our actions have impacts throughout the system. What we do matters, and consumers should ask questions about where their goods come from. It's not just a choice for those who decide to be engaged with this issue, but it's an obligation on all of us. Retailers too, I would argue, are at fault. International firms which go into markets such as India or Bangladesh seeking greater and greater volumes of goods faster and faster for cheaper and cheaper prices are fostering a culture of cutthroat competition, of shortcuts and of disregard for workers' safety. I've spoken to factory owners in Bangladesh who say they've lost shirt contracts on half a cent per garment, and with sports ball makers in Jalandhar who say the difference between winning an order and losing it is 1 rupee a ball. This is an unhealthy culture of hyper-competition, and it rewards those who bow to its pressures and leaves those who resist it to go broke or to starve. There are pressures on these foreign retailers, I appreciate. There are bottom lines to consider and shareholders to answer to. But I would argue that the rights of their workers, and however distantly removed they may be, they are their workers, should outweigh those considerations. Foreign companies are at fault too for hiding, and I use the word deliberately. I use hiding deliberately because that's precisely what happens behind codes of conduct, behind third-party audits of factories. Companies know that in many cases these documents are not worth the paper they're written on, that auditors' inspections are too commonly just shams. These are used to demonstrate to concerned customers or to shareholders back home that all is okay, but they often bear little resemblance to the true situation. They don't protect workers, in fact they often leave them vulnerable. They leave them vulnerable to abuse that's committed, safe in the knowledge that there's cover in the form of a corporate code or an all clear on an inspection. And again, a plea of ignorance is no reasonable excuse. Companies know that these processes are regularly rorted. It is, I stress once more, a hyper-competitive business, and businesses under pressure will look to cut corners, to obfuscate and to obscure. Fault lies too with factory owners, those who employ children, who farm work out of factories to homes where it can be done in secret more cheaply, or who send people to work in dangerous buildings. We see extreme examples of it. When huge cracks emerged in the illegally built Rana Plaza building, the owner used armed guards to force his workers back inside. Less than an hour later, the building collapsed, killing more than 1,000 people. But there are less extreme iterations. The factory owner who, under pressure to fill more orders, removes the firefighting gear from the stairs or the factory floor to put more sewing machines in, who stores extra rolls of fabric in the staircase, which blocks the way out, who locks the doors and bars of the windows because he's worried about theft. Again, I would argue these processes, these practices are the result of the enormous pressure that is being brought to bear on these factories. The pressure to win contracts, to fill ever larger orders and to do it more and more cheaply. The margins are tiny, so volumes need to be massive and turnarounds tight. That requires more of everything. More working hours, more staff, making more and more shirts and pants and footballs more and more cheaply. The parties without fault in these arcane supply chains are the ones who suffer most. The employees on the factory floor, the pieceworker at home. These people are some of the poorest in the world, often illiterate and desperate for any income they can earn. Two, they know they are undistinguished from millions of other desperate people and families. If they think the work they are being offered is unsafe or the pay is too low to live on, the boss will find someone else willing to do it. They have no real choice at all. All of the pressures of the supply chain, the consumer's desire for a bargain, the foreign investor's demand for the lowest price, the factory owner's insistence on longer hours, all of these come to bear on the shoulders of the workers at the end of the line. They stand on the bottom rung of the ladder, likely never to get off. But the issues of fair and ethical trade, of workers' pay and conditions, even the issue of child labour, are not as black and white as they might seem from the distance and comfort of Australia. These problems are far more nuanced in the developing world and worthy of closer examination. Here I'll briefly look at Bangladesh and at India separately. That the Bangladesh garment industry is troubled, deeply corrupted and in need of reform is not contested, but the industry has also brought enormous benefit to that country. The garment industry is worth upwards of $20 billion a year to Bangladesh. It generates more than 80% of that country's foreign export earnings. It's no exaggeration to say that if the Bangladesh garment industry disappeared, the country's economy would collapse. And the industry has helped some of the poorest people in Bangladesh. In Dhaka alone, there are upwards of 4,000 factories employing something around 4 million people. 80% of these workers are women. Most of them have had little education and who cannot read and write. These are people who would not be able to find work anywhere else were it not for this industry. So the garment industry has given some of the world's poorest people a first or a second income and has dragged tens of millions of people from poverty. But often the way the industry is run has kept millions from progressing beyond bare subsistence. Wages are so low, conditions are so poor that people are trapped into simple subsistence. The reasons one goes to work to pay for a house, to raise a family, are luxuries beyond contemplation. I remember sitting with a man called Farhad Mia in his bedsit in a Dhaka slum. The jury-rig hovel he calls a home is a constant fire hazard, and it will be a death trap the day that it catches fire. He is a stitcher in a factory that sends expensive shirts all over the world, and he told me, "We cannot have a humane life. There are many things we cannot have. We can only afford meat once or twice in a month. We cannot buy medicine if we are sick." In the city of Jalandhar in India's Punjab, millions of sports balls are stitched every year. Many of them end up in Australian backyards, being punted and passed by Australian children. Sadly, many of them are stitched by poor Indian children the same age. The sports ball industry at a macroeconomic level has been a boom. It has brought industry, commerce and wealth to a part of the country that never knew it. But as always, the devil lies in the detail. The balls are supposed to be stitched in factories where work practices are regulated, but unscrupulous companies or a rogue operator, they will send the balls out the back door to neighbourhood slums where the stitching work, which is painful and difficult and menial labour, is farmed out to families to be performed for a handful of rupees per ball. Again, this is not in of itself illegal or immoral, but it is a lack of practice, a lack of control of this practice that is troublesome. Again, these are poor families. Stitching at home can be a welcome source of extra income for mothers with young children who can't leave home to go to work. Even children helping out stitching balls after school is not objectionable here. And here I think lies an important distinction between child work and child labour. Child work, where a child works a few hours after school to supplement a meagre family income, is understandable here, and it can be argued even necessary. Child labour, conversely, when children are pulled out of school or stopped from ever going so that they can work full-time, entrenches desperate disadvantage. Child labour, beyond the moral argument of depriving a boy or a girl, and sadly it is most often a girl, of his or her childhood, is an economic disaster. It condemns a child to an existence of menial, low-paying work, a life of hand-to-mouth poverty. Education in a country as competitive as India is incredibly important. It is the most crucial distinction in determining one's life's chances. But even this can be a difficult argument to prosecute. Education is about tomorrow. Child labour is about getting through today. I spoke with one sad mother who said she wished she could send her two girls, Rupa and Sonali, who are 10 and 11, to school. Instead, they spent all day, from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m, sitting on a low stool stitching footballs for Australian children to play with. And their mother told me, "We can't afford for them to go to school. We can't worry about the future because we need to eat today, so they have to work." Now, these examples are extreme ones, but they exist, and they exist in massive numbers. They are a product of the interconnected global economy the world has created. And it's an economy that has brought enormous opportunities to communities once far removed from international trade. Development may have been unequal and uneven, but it has been development nonetheless. Free trade has been undeniably positive for the world. And regardless, the globalisation genie is out of the bottle and can't be recorked. Now, this does not mean there should be permitted a laissez-faire, rapacious survival of the fittest mentality to global trade. Free trade must continue, but there needs to be care taken in the way global supply chains are managed and production is practiced. To remove the garment industry from Bangladesh or the sports ball industry from India as a kind of post facto punitive measure would be disastrous and wrong. These industries have the potential to bring enormous benefits to millions of people in developing countries, as well as profits to the company who source from them. But foreign companies must be in these markets in a way that is mutually beneficial to themselves and to the workers rather than predatory. This can be done. Foreign companies might have to pay a higher price, they might have to sacrifice some profit, they might temporarily lose market share, but the long-term benefits far outweigh these impositions. Fair trade has demonstrated this is possible in a host of industries, and it makes good business as well as ethical sense. Because Bangladesh makes good clothes and cheaply, India makes good footballs and cheaply. These countries have huge competitive advantages that they and the companies who do business there should profit from. There are massive willing workforces available, labour costs are low, supply chains are established and reliable. It is possible for Australian companies to go into markets like Bangladesh or India to ensure that the workers who make their goods go to work in a safe environment and are paid a living wage and to still make a handsome profit. The profits might not be as high as if they'd fought for the lowest price and the basest conditions, but the benefits to a company's reputation, to its long-term viability and towards establishing a more equitable global economy are undoubted. All this beyond the fact that it is simply the right thing to do.